Right, so the United States is bemoaning Iran-backed Hamas and Iran-backed Yemen as if it is some kind of a slur or an insult that you point out who might be funding them. And the whole world should look at Hamas and Yemen and go, "Oh, you must be bad because Americans says so." All the media push that prefix of Iran-backed as if it's the boogeyman behind all the war and death and destruction we are currently seeing in the Middle East. In which case, should they not start referring to apartheid Israel as US-backed apartheid Israel? It's only fair, isn't it? That's impartiality, isn't it? What we have in these media narratives is a message of what the US says goes. When the US have continued to delay aid and block a ceasefire ending the Gaza genocide, why the hell should we care one iota for who they say are the bad guys, when they've done nothing but shame themselves in their incessant backing for a rogue state carpet bombing an occupied territory with impunity? Why should we take notice of what they are saying when all eyes are on the consequences of their backing of Israel and the role they've had in all of this? Right, so as I was reading through various articles today, as I do, looking to see what I would cover in my video content today, this is the wrestling match I often have with myself. What will I cover? What do I think isn't getting talked about sufficiently? Which two stories stand out or haven't really been noticed? And I happened across a Reuters story with the headline, "US says Iran deeply involved in Red Sea attacks on commercial vessels." And I sat there to myself and I thought, well, hang on, I covered what Yemen were doing just the other day, solidarity with Palestine, blockading Israeli or Israeli-destined vessels only, and here we have the US apparently blaming Iran for that now. Pretty sure it's the Houthis here causing shipping problems for Israel, inflicting their own versions of sanctions because everyone else is failing to do so themselves collectively, and all Israel need to do to end that blockade is stop bombing Gaza. So this headline actually made me a little bit cross, a little bit angry. We know the US don't like Iran, and Iran is far from a perfect country in itself, ruled as it is by a religious leader, an ayatollah, following a coup in 1979 to remove the ruling Shah, who had become incredibly unpopular. The Shah was exiled, many of his officials were executed. The new regime was not a nice one. The US, as always, were involved. The Shah had fled stateside, and the US refused to extradite him. The US embassy ended up being taken by force, and those that worked there held hostage. Failure to negotiate their release contributed in part to the fall of Jimmy Carter's administration and ushered in Ronald Reagan. But in more recent times, back in 2020, the general of Iran's Revolutionary Army was assassinated in the US. There have been no formal diplomatic relations between the United States and Iran since 1980. They do not get on. They do not like each other. On that basis, then, any story that carries a headline saying that the US are blaming Iran backed whoever really should be taken with a bit of a so what attitude, especially in the Middle East, where Israel are very much US backed, and we know this in no uncertain terms. The United States are supplying arms to the point Biden bypassed Congress to get military paraphernalia out to Israel as fast as he could, despite knowing exactly what it is being used for, allegedly to take out Hamas operatives, but far more efficient at killing civilians and destroying civilian infrastructure, along with killing UN workers, aid workers from multiple different agencies, and doing nothing to ease tensions. Every time a ceasefire is attempted at the UN Security Council, it fails because the US, as permanent members, have vetoed it. And now we're hearing the Palestinians are to petition the Swiss to convene a Geneva Conventions conference to say Israel are breaching those accords, the rules of war, and the US are trying to stymie that now as well, to put Israel above the Geneva Conventions in effect, allowing them, as a consequence, to be able to bomb and kill whoever and whatever without any accountability, which is just terrifying. That's what I call really having someone's back and then some. That's what I call backing someone. Israel is US backed. And this all came into sharp clarity just yesterday, though, as after holding up an aid package, because they didn't like the idea of a ceasefire being a requirement of getting aid in, harking back to memories of those humanitarian pauses Sunak and Starmer wanted several weeks ago. The United States finally accepted the wording, creating the conditions for the cessation of hostilities. The US accepted this so much, they abstained on voting for it. It was nice of them, wasn't it? They literally got their way and still wouldn't end up voting for it. The UK, incidentally, did vote for this, and both Sunak and Starmer have been crowing about how wonderful all this is and how much progress is being made. But it's bullshit. And Russia, who also abstained, nobody voted against it, so the resolution passed, but Russia, who also abstained, called out this US-backed phraseology, saying it is too ambiguous for them to back. Creating the conditions for a cessation of hostilities could quite conceivably mean the utter destruction of Gaza, for all we know. There's no description, so to speak, of what that constitutes. So the resolution itself is an absolute failure to hold Israel to account. US backing for Israel wins the day again. But that Iran backing, let's look at that for a moment. Let's look at Hamas then. Are they Iran-backed? Yes. Or at least they were up to one point. They would have collapsed years ago without Iranian aid, without Iranian financing. Relations between Palestine and Iran are positive because Palestine backed the 1979 revolution, and also because Palestinians are under the cosh of a US-backed state. And we know what Iran and the US think of each other by now at this point in the video, do we not? But Palestine is also occupied territory. Nothing gets in or out without Israel allowing it. Yet somehow Iran does manage to get military aid in as well as money. Without that, it wouldn't just be Hamas collapsing. It would be Palestinian society, as limited as they are in being able to support themselves because they're under occupation. That said, it is alleged Iranian support stopped in 2015 when Hamas supported rebels in the Syrian civil war. Syria, another country Iran do not get in with. How much truth there is to that, I do not know, but that is the claim. As for Yemen, Iran do support the Houthis, who now form the government as of 2019, but who for years were rebels fighting against a US-backed Yemeni government. So the US's problem with Yemen stems from them no longer having the influence over it they once did. It all seems to be a matter of which big beast country backs which smaller, poorer states in the Middle East, whether it is a wealthy backer like Iran or Saudi Arabia in the Middle East themselves, or the US out in the West. As such, how much should we care who has influence with who? How will history judge these involved states at the end of the day here? Is that not what it ultimately comes down to? But does that also not tell us to an extent how some of these states should be being judged now? The US is backing Israel. Israel are committing genocide and have been an occupying power for decades. Neither of these states deserves to come out of this well now or in 50 or 100 years from now when people look back on it. The US have blocked the path to peace repeatedly here, are still doing so, and Israel do not want it anyway. They want Palestinians gone from the face of the earth. They no longer want the two-state solution, we're told. Their actions in Gaza, their indiscriminate attacks that we are all sitting up and taking notice of, in no way do the US or Israel or any other supportive organisations or governments from the UK to the EU and more come out of this picture well. So what about Iran then? Well, do they still fund Hamas? That is open to question based on what we know. As for the Houthis in Yemen, sure, they are. But what are they backing them in doing right now? Yemen are taking action in solidarity with Palestine to hurt Israel economically by blocking shipping, and that has now made them a target for the US as well, because they just keep digging themselves an ever deeper reputational hole to bury themselves in, along with all of those other ridiculous countries who signed up to their Operation Guardians of Prosperity, because it is prosperity for Israel only they are interested in, not the Palestinians, and Yemen have chosen differently. Would you like an update on how much more ridiculous that operation has become now, by the way? Because France, Italy and Spain have all just withdrawn from it, leaving the USA with the Seychelles and Bahrain. Yemen have already won, basically, haven't they? In all seriousness, though, they position themselves against a genocide. Other countries have been shamed into it now, but ultimately that should be what we are all against, isn't it? When you boil all of this situation down, the prevention of a genocide should be what we all want. That isn't the case, though, clearly. So who is on the side of that? Well, Iran backed Yemen, certainly. In fact, Yemen is so defiant of the US right now and their dwindling Prosperity Guardians gang, they've literally released a video taking the piss out of Top Gun, complete with Kenny Loggins' Danger Zone playing in the background, of them getting ready to keep on doing what they are doing. And it's hilarious. And you really should look for it on social media. Openly mocking the US position, and why not? They've brought it on themselves and they still aren't learning from it. They are very much on the wrong side of this story, and people worldwide, their eyes are open to it. But then you can't avoid talking about Hamas and all of this. Not so much Palestine itself, so many civilians caught in the crossfire who just want to survive right now. Just Hamas on its own. How will they be remembered for what they've done? We can talk about October 7th and since only, but that does a disservice to the whole story, which goes back to 1967 and 1948. And do bear in mind, Hamas weren't around at that point. They only came into being in the 1980s. Palestinians just want the right to live now, the right to form a state of their own, a land to call their own, land that was taken from them, basically. And regardless of what they instigated on October 7th in Hamas, how will they be remembered? How do you think they're going to be remembered? Will it be for either drawing global attention to the case of Palestine again in a time of social media where the evils being perpetrated there are exposed as never before, and global opinion of the situation has shifted, and hopefully set things on a course of action to bring Israel into line and held accountable like every other country on earth is, to the same level, and not placed on a US-backed pedestal above reproach, or they'll die in the attempt? Either way, and as controversial as this might sound, I don't think Hamas will be remembered for the events of the here and now as badly as Israel will be, and their US backers will be, and neither will Yemen, the actions of whom I went into in more detail on this video here. So if you want to know exactly how they're getting under American and Israeli skin, you need to watch this video next, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.